There is a reason the past suddenly feels louder than it has in a long time. Something your soulmate believed about you is beginning to crack, and the truth behind it has finally found its way to the surface. You may not see the full picture yet, but somewhere behind the scenes, a conversation, a memory, or a piece of information has forced them to look backward. And this time, they can't look away. Because the story they accepted about you was never the complete story. They heard things, they made assumptions, they listened to people who sounded convincing at the time, and slowly, without realizing it, they built an entire version of you inside their mind that wasn't entirely real. But now, something has happened that made those old assumptions impossible to defend. Suddenly, moments they dismissed are coming back with completely different meaning. Words you once said are echoing in their head. Your silence makes sense. Your distance makes sense. Even the things they once considered confusing about you are starting to fit together like pieces of a puzzle they were never given permission to finish. And here's the part that may surprise you. Someone may have tried to tell your soulmate the truth before. They may have warned them, questioned what they believed, or pointed out something your soulmate refused to see. But your soulmate wasn't ready. They trusted the wrong explanation because it was easier than facing the possibility that they had misunderstood you. Now they're being forced to confront something far more painful than losing the connection. They're realizing they may have pushed away someone who was never their enemy in the first place. And as this truth continues unfolding, one question is becoming impossible for them to escape. Who told them the wrong story about you? And why? Because the answer to that question is where everything begins to change. There was someone who knew more than your soulmate realized, and somehow that person could no longer keep the truth buried. Maybe it came through a conversation that was never supposed to happen. Maybe it was a message sent at the wrong time, an old memory suddenly mentioned, or a simple question that opened a door nobody was prepared to walk through. Whatever happened, something cracked the old story. And once that crack appeared, everything your soulmate thought they understood about you started falling apart piece by piece. You need to understand something, chosen one. The truth didn't suddenly become true because someone finally revealed it. It was always there. Your soulmate simply wasn't looking in the right direction. They had been staring at the version of the story that was handed to them, never realizing that important pieces had been left out. And now someone has finally placed those missing pieces directly in front of them. Imagine carrying a photograph for years, believing it captured the entire moment, only to discover that half of the picture had been cut away. That's what this realization feels like for them. Suddenly, details they once ignored are becoming impossible to ignore. They remember the way you reacted when certain things happened. They remember the conversations where you tried to explain yourself. They remember moments when you became quiet instead of fighting back. They remember the times you walked away without giving them the explanation they demanded. Back then, they thought your silence meant you didn't care. Now they're beginning to wonder if your silence was the only thing protecting you from saying something that would have exposed everything too soon. And this is where the story becomes painful. Someone may have influenced the way your soulmate saw you. Not necessarily by inventing everything from nothing, but by giving them just enough information to create the wrong conclusion. That's more powerful than an obvious lie, because incomplete truth can look incredibly convincing. They may have heard one side of the story and never searched for yours. They may have believed someone's version because it arrived before your explanation ever had a chance. They may have trusted a person who sounded confident while you were standing there, exhausted from trying to make someone understand what you couldn't force them to see. And now your soulmate is beginning to recognize the pattern. One memory connects to another. One conversation suddenly explains another. A moment they once considered insignificant now feels like evidence. Something you said years ago suddenly carries a completely different meaning. They are realizing that you weren't behaving randomly. There was a reason behind your distance. There was a reason behind your hesitation. There was a reason you stopped explaining yourself. And the deeper they go into the past, the more uncomfortable the truth becomes. Because eventually, they reach the moment where they remember you actually tried to tell them. You gave them signs. You gave them opportunities to ask questions. You may have even looked them in the eyes, hoping they would understand without you having to reveal every painful detail. But they listened to the louder voice instead. They chose the explanation that required less emotional courage. And now that explanation is collapsing. That's why their regret feels different this time. They aren't simply thinking about what they lost. They're thinking about what they could have prevented if they had listened to you sooner. And somewhere in the middle of all these memories, one realization is becoming impossible to escape. The person they trusted to explain you may have been the very person who kept them from understanding you. But there's something even deeper hidden behind that discovery. Because once your soulmate realizes who influenced their perception, they're going to uncover the one detail that changes how they remember the entire connection. And then came the part your soulmate never expected. The moment they finally remembered what you said, what you warned them about, and what you were desperately trying to make them understand before everything changed. At first, they may have tried to dismiss it. They may have told themselves they were remembering things incorrectly, that too much time had passed, that emotions were making the past look different. But the more they thought about it, the harder it became to escape the truth. Because suddenly, your words weren't random anymore. They were clues. Your reactions weren't confusing anymore. They were responses to things they couldn't see. Your silence wasn't rejection. It was exhaustion. And your distance wasn't proof that you stopped caring. It may have been the moment you realized that explaining yourself to someone who had already chosen another version of the story was only hurting you more. This is where your soulmate's entire understanding begins to turn upside down. They start replaying conversations in their mind, like scenes from a movie they watched years ago but never understood. They remember the exact moments when you tried to speak and they interrupted. They remember when you became quiet and they assumed you were cold. They remember when you pulled away and convinced themselves you were playing games. They remember every time someone else's opinion seemed to carry more weight than your own explanation. And now, with the truth finally sitting in front of them, those memories hit differently. Suddenly, the person they thought was difficult to understand becomes the person they never truly tried hard enough to understand. That realization can hurt more than the separation itself. Because losing someone is painful, but discovering that you helped create the distance through a misunderstanding can haunt you in a completely different way. Your soulmate may now be asking themselves questions they avoided for a long time. Why didn't I listen? Why did I believe that version? Why did I assume the worst? Why did I let someone else's words become louder than the person standing right in front of me? And perhaps the most painful question of all is this: what would have happened if I had believed you the first time? That question doesn't have an easy answer, because now they can see possibilities that no longer belong to the past. They can imagine conversations that never happened, moments they walked away from, chances they allowed to disappear because they believed they already knew the truth. It's like finding an old letter years after throwing away the envelope, and suddenly realizing the message inside could have changed everything. They can't go back and read it sooner. They can't erase what they believed. They can't undo every decision that followed. All they can do is finally understand what they refused to understand before. And this is where the emotional weight becomes even heavier, because your soulmate may realize that you weren't asking them to blindly choose your side. You were asking them to hear you. There is a difference. You weren't demanding that they believe everything you said without question. You simply wanted them to give your truth the same chance they gave everyone else's, but they didn't. And now they are seeing the consequences of that choice. The strange part is that you may have already made peace with the past while they are only beginning to confront it. You may have stopped waiting for an explanation. You may have stopped expecting an apology. You may have learned to carry your own truth without needing anyone else to validate it. And that is precisely why this realization can shake them so deeply. They may have expected you to remain frozen in the place where they left you, still waiting, still explaining, still trying to prove your heart. But you didn't stay there. You grew beyond that version of yourself. You learned that sometimes the truth doesn't need to chase people. It simply waits until their own experience forces them to see it. And now their own experience is doing exactly that. Every new piece of information is pulling another thread from the story they once believed. The picture they built is unraveling, not because you are trying to destroy it, but because reality can no longer fit inside the version they created. And somewhere inside that realization, they may finally understand the one thing you wanted them to understand all along. You weren't asking them to choose between you and the world. You were asking them to know you before judging you. But they judged first, listened later, and now the truth has arrived after the damage was already done. Yet there is still another layer to this story, because discovering that they misunderstood your past is only the beginning. The next realization is about you, the person they thought they knew, and why your actions were never what they seemed. Now your soulmate is beginning to see you through a completely different lens. The person they once thought was distant, complicated, or impossible to understand is suddenly becoming clearer, and that realization is forcing them to revisit everything they believed about your behavior. They are starting to understand that your silence was never empty. There were emotions underneath it. Things you were carrying that you didn't know how to explain without making the situation even more painful. They may remember how you pulled away when things became overwhelming, and for the first time, they are asking themselves whether you were actually protecting your heart instead of trying to punish theirs. They are looking at your past reactions differently now. What they once called stubbornness may have been boundaries. What they called coldness may have been self-protection. What they called distance may have been the result of feeling misunderstood for too long. And this realization is uncomfortable because it means they may have judged the very behaviors that were actually revealing how deeply you cared. You weren't always silent because you had nothing to say. Sometimes you were silent because you had already said everything you could, and repeating yourself to someone who wasn't ready to hear you would only make the wound deeper. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that now. They may even realize that you gave them more chances than they ever noticed. You waited for them to ask the right question. You waited for them to look beyond what other people were saying. You waited for them to notice the small things your words couldn't explain. But eventually you stopped waiting, not because the connection meant nothing, but because you realized your worth couldn't depend on someone else's ability to recognize it. And that may be the part that affects your soulmate the most. You didn't become stronger because you stopped caring. You became stronger because you finally understood that love should not require you to constantly prove that your heart is genuine. Now they are looking at the version of you that survived everything they once misunderstood, and they are seeing something they never expected to see. Peace. You are no longer desperately trying to correct the story. You are no longer chasing their approval. You are no longer standing at the door, asking them to believe you. And somehow, that quiet transformation speaks louder than every explanation you ever gave. It's as if the universe allowed time to become the witness you never had. Time exposed what arguments couldn't. Time revealed what emotions couldn't prove. Time allowed your actions to speak after your words had been ignored. And now your soulmate may be realizing that you were never asking for perfection. You were asking for understanding. You wanted someone who would pause before judging, listen before assuming, and look deeper before believing what they were told. They may now recognize that your heart wasn't difficult to reach. It was simply tired of being misunderstood. And that realization changes the emotional balance completely, because the person who once thought you were the problem is beginning to wonder whether they were the one who failed to see what was right in front of them. But there is one final realization waiting for them, and this one may be the hardest of all. Because once they understand who you really were, throughout the entire story. They will have to face what their mistake actually cost them, and whether the connection they once walked away from still has a place in their future. And now we reach the part your soulmate may have been avoiding from the very beginning. The truth is no longer something they can question, postpone, or explain away. They have seen enough pieces to understand what really happened, and with that understanding comes a realization that hurts far more than they expected. They didn't simply misunderstand a situation. They misunderstood you. They misunderstood your intentions, your silence, your distance, and perhaps even the love you were trying to express when you didn't have the words to explain everything. And now they are looking back at the entire connection with different eyes. Every moment carries a different meaning. Every conversation has another layer. Every time you walked away, every time you became quiet, every time you stopped fighting to be understood, they are beginning to recognize what was really happening. You weren't giving up on the connection because you didn't care. You were giving up on trying to convince someone who had already decided what your truth was supposed to look like. And that realization can create a kind of regret that doesn't disappear easily. Your soulmate may be asking themselves why they waited so long to listen, why they allowed other voices to influence something that was supposed to be understood between two people, why they trusted assumptions when they could have simply trusted the person standing in front of them. And the hardest part is that they may now realize you didn't need them to rescue you. You needed them to understand you. There is a huge difference. You weren't asking them to fight the entire world for you. You were asking them not to turn against you because of a story they never fully investigated. But the past has a strange way of revealing what people couldn't see when emotions were controlling everything. Time removes the noise, distance removes the pressure. And once the emotional fog clears, people can finally recognize what was standing in front of them all along. Your soulmate may now be seeing that your connection wasn't destroyed because the feelings weren't real. It was damaged because too many assumptions were allowed to speak louder than the truth. And now that truth has finally surfaced, they can't return to the old version of the story. They can't pretend they don't know what they know. They can't look at your past behavior the same way anymore. Something has changed inside them. But here's where you need to pay attention, because this isn't only about their regret. This is about your transformation. You survived the version of this story where nobody understood you. You survived the moments when you questioned whether your own heart was being seen correctly. You survived being misunderstood without allowing that misunderstanding to become your identity. And now, whether your soulmate returns immediately or takes time to process everything, you are no longer standing in the same emotional place where they left you. That matters, because if they come back, they won't be meeting the person they once misunderstood. They'll be meeting someone who learned how to live without needing their validation. Someone who discovered that their worth doesn't become smaller simply because another person failed to recognize it. Someone who finally understands that the truth doesn't need to scream to become undeniable. It simply needs time. And perhaps that is why this revelation arrived now instead of years ago. Maybe the timing had to be different because both of you had to become different. Maybe your soulmate needed to experience enough distance to understand what your presence actually meant. Maybe they needed to lose access to your energy before they could recognize how much of it they once took for granted. And now they're left with a decision they can't avoid forever. Do they remain silent because approaching you feels frightening? Or do they finally gather the courage to acknowledge what they should have acknowledged long ago? You may notice subtle signs before anything direct happens. A sudden message, an unexpected attempt to reconnect. Someone mentioning their name, a strange coincidence that brings an old memory back to the surface. Or perhaps nothing happens immediately because they are still processing the weight of what they discovered. Don't mistake silence for the absence of realization. Sometimes people become quiet when the truth hits deeper than they expected. Your soulmate may need time to confront their own choices before they can approach you honestly. But one thing has changed permanently. The old story no longer controls them. The truth does. And that truth is forcing them to see that you were never the person they needed to escape from. You were the person they needed to understand. They may regret not listening sooner, but you don't have to carry that regret for them. Your role was never to chase someone into believing your heart. Your role was to remain true to yourself while life revealed what words could not. And now the past has finally spoken. It has exposed what was hidden, corrected what was misunderstood, and placed the missing pieces where they can no longer be ignored. So if you've been wondering whether everything you experienced meant nothing, remember this. Sometimes the truth arrives after the connection has already changed, because the purpose isn't always to recreate the past. Sometimes the truth arrives to reveal why the past happened the way it did. And if your soulmate is truly meant to return, they won't come back carrying the same assumptions. They'll come back carrying a different understanding. They will know what they failed to see. They will remember what they failed to hear. And most importantly, they will finally understand why you stopped explaining yourself. The truth didn't come back to chase you. It came back to set the record straight. And now the question isn't whether your soulmate finally understands. The question is what they are willing to do with that understanding now that they can no longer pretend they don't know the truth.